Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Indeed, neither Dale or I are dead. We're still here and occasionally pop up our heads in the whack-a-mole of Christian podcasts to reassert our existence. And this is one of those days. Hopefully, we'll be able to do this a little more frequently. But lots has been going on in each of our lives and in the life of the Davenant Institute. That's part of what's kept us from more shows, as it were, more conversations to put out in the public. Dale is busy at work building a couple of schools still in Brevard County in Florida. Really successful work going on there. I'm busy with some developments in the Davenant Institute with a recent grant we got and some projects that have come of that, as well as a book I'm writing. And we're really excited, both of us, about the new hire at the Davenant Institute.
Yes.
Through a lot of change in the last couple months. But a recent change that we're really excited about is that Wyatt Graham has recently come on as our executive director. And that's a really fun development. And we're really excited and looking forward to working with him. And in the meantime, Dale and I have continued to talk, as we always do. And actually, a lot of our conversation has kind of come out of this really the vocation of teaching, really the fact that we sit in front of students a lot of the time, and maybe of different ages. I have students ranging from maybe the early 20s to much older, but I'd say maybe the average student I'm talking to is early 20s to mid 30s or something like that. And the average student Dale is, of course, talking to is a teenager. Nevertheless, one of the things we've found ourselves as we've been reflecting on teaching our students that we've come back to in light of the questions we often get asked by students is, as it were, the cultural plausibility structures. What feels morally plausible to average people out there right now? That's becoming a big question. So, for instance, there are questions that a really well-meaning normie student can ask you in 2024 that maybe you would not have expected from a student 20 or 30 years ago. And a lot of that has to do with the environment in which this new crop of this new generation, including Dale and myself, but especially as you get younger than Dale and myself, there are some dynamics at play, forces at play that kind of are creating new epistemic plausibility structures that are generating the kinds of questions we're facing in our students. And that's been a large part of what we've been talking about over the last several months. But, before, I don't want to overly specify because this is a podcast and we move dialectically like good Socratic bros. And so I'm going to throw it over to you, Dale. And
Yeah, I think that's the right way to say it. And I wonder if it's just part of the way that teaching or subjects that are talked about and discussed and debated just end up unfolding as history progresses. So, like, for an example, we're far enough away, from communism being an actual threat that our discussions about the reasons for communism and the implications for communism and who the bad guys are become almost like a mythos or a fairy tale in the mind and less real when it comes to, what's actually happening with the implementation of communism. And so it gives us a more free range because we're not actually dealing with the thing, we're dealing with the idea of the thing, and not just the idea of the thing, but the idea of the thing after several decades, in some cases centuries, right? So I wonder if we're just in a very privileged position to adjudicate things that were thought very carefully about and kind of avoided or set up with care, because we're not actually facing the actual threat of the thing, if this makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really, go ahead. No, you were going to say something.
Well, yeah, the last thing I'll say on that is, and we also are setting the way that educators have been dealing with ancient texts. Takes the Communist Manifesto. I was just talking about this in my last class. The Communist Manifesto is normally presented, let's say you're in a conservative Christian school, it's normally presented and the teacher will maybe set up the reading of it by saying, Karl Marx was a bad guy, millions of people died. In this book, we're going to notice that he's a materialist and this and this and this. And then when we read the book, our moral judgments are already framed for us. And so now we just have to either explain further why he was a bad guy, or explain further why his ideas were bad, and how we can, function as a bulwark against the reemergence of these problems, rather than just sitting in the text without any presuppositions or any framing, and then discussing the text. So I think that the educational model and the fact that we're far enough away from some of these moral questions, at least in the political realm, is contributing to the students having a more liberal approach. When I say that, they're taking more liberties with what kind of questions they can ask about these things, if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're reminding me of something I've been reading in the last several months, which is Owen Barfield has this notion in his book, Saving the Appearances, that the subtitle of Saving the Appearances is often not focused on. Saving the Appearances is kind of the famous title, but the subtitle is A Study in Idolatry. And what he's really trying to think through is, what does a modern idol look like? In the ancient world, he says, there's something about the very nature of consciousness and the very nature of the way people were kind of interacting with the world and with the cosmos, such that it was nearly inevitable that the form an idol would take would be basically a kind of totemic statue, as it were. Right. And so there's kind of like the god that the statue represents, that's sort of a totem of its power and that sort of thing. But that obviously, no, they didn't necessarily think everything about the god reduced to the statue. But what he asks, with all the kind of transitions in consciousness and culture that you see in the modern world, what he asks becomes sort of idolatry in the modern world. And in his view, it's basically ideologies. And what he means, he's very careful in how he's framing this. What he means by that is something like the direct contact with reality through a system that maybe does arise from reality, but while forgetting all of the steps that got you to that system. And then you're just kind of free floating in the system and kind of going back down into reality, rather than, for instance, saying like Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica, all of the ways in which he is trying to help communicate reality to you in the Summa Theologica start very concretely on the ground. And he's building brick by brick into the clouds. Right. And what you wind up having in the modern world is kind of the loss of the contact with the world that helped you build all those bricks. And so you sort of start in the clouds, and then you have the conversation as you just described it. Well, it's like, we're in the clouds, here are the answers. And so you go back into the thing in front of your face, and you don't learn the wisdom of building from the bottom to the top. You kind of pretend to be in the clouds. Because you're not actually there. That's the interesting thing. You kind of pretend to imagine yourself to be in the clouds and to be building a ladder from those clouds back to the ground, when in fact you're always on the ground. And I think the way to the way to articulate that would be something like this. You could imagine that the traditional order of things, which might be the right order of things, your neighborhood, as it were, the neighborhood of human custom, has had an atom bomb absolutely blow it up. Mm-hmm. And what you can do is draw a picture and a map of what the old neighborhood used to look like, and then stare at your map and say, I am now living in reality. Right. When in fact, all the while, the neighborhood is still in ruins, and actually what it is to live in reality, even according to that map, would be to rebuild the neighborhood. And I think these are some of the tensions that, and we're not. I'm going to throw it back to you, and then we'll come back to Gen Z and the epistemic crisis there, because this is all part of it.
Yeah. No, those are really good thoughts. I think the internet, we've got Jonathan Haidt's book out now. And so in some ways we can no longer ignore the elephant in the room when it comes to the relationship between emotional distress, especially in younger people, and the internet and smartphones and social media. It's just this is the reality we live in now, and we need to stop refusing to see it for what it is. And so let's move forward and try to figure this out, right? And the reason I bring that up is because I think that this sort of beginning in the clouds notion is really facilitated, or the kind of shortcut to the clouds is found in a cluster of information one comes across on social media. So in other words, I can learn this tidbit and this factoid and this paragraph that's pulled out of this work, along with commentary in the comment section from a bunch of people that are all approaching this subject, whatever it is. And I can begin to have facts and commentary and opinion floating around in my mind without there being any logos, like a connecting principle that holds all of those ideas together and allows me to think clearly about them so that I can arrive at good judgment. Instead, they all just sort of like collect into a blob of thoughts that are then, one thing that I keep saying is I think we're in a dark age, and not just because we're ignorant and we don't know how to intellectually build that bridge to the heavens, but also because we're more than ever we are celebrated for letting the desires of our belly give full vent. And so now what we do is we have this collection of information that's floating around in the brain without any controlling principle, and we can express ourselves and give full vent to our passions, and we're rewarded for that. And if you find the right circle of people on social media, then you get all the dopamine from all the hearts and all the likes and all of the positive reinforcement. And so we're actually becoming, I think it's like a perfect storm for us to become more orcish and to lose our humanity in some way. Precisely because we don't have the ability to reason well anymore, and we don't have the social checks and balances on venting our base desires. And as a matter of fact, it's the complete opposite. We're celebrated for that, and we can choose to be celebrated that because we can choose our own communities. So yeah, just some thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting that there's sort of a social formation. There's a social pedagogy, you might say, that is shaping us to behave in public space in a particular way. And one of the things you and I have been talking about that I'd want to add to that is the kind of, we've been talking a lot on our phone calls about this phrase epistemic abuse. I think it would be fair to say that Gen Z is the most epistemically abused generation in history, and I mean something like that, like this by that. It's actually natural. It's according to natural law that you trust and gain a lot of your orientation in the universe through the adults around you, through your parents and through your teachers and through your clergy.
Right.
And what if you live in a world where really there is a kind of collective pathology that could be incubated through parents and clergy and through your school, to such a degree, such a loss of contact with reality at such a wide degree of pedagogy, to such a degree that maybe your average 12-year-old boy is looking at the world and going, this is complete insanity, and I don't understand why I should respect any of this. Like at that young of an age, the level of this can't be real is already coming out. When you put that together, you're really damaging any ability to trust any kind of authority, any kind of epistemic or academic authority. And so you take a culture like America, where we already have a kind of enculturated suspicion of, kind of the experts and the elites, and you have to modify that through reason and have some sense of where experts and elites have their function and blah, blah, blah. But you add to that a kind of expertise in elitegum and a kind of cast of our parents, especially that first layer of parents and pedagogues, relative to whom your trust structures develop in the most intimate ways. When that fails you at such a big level about, whether or not you're able to tell if you're a boy or a girl,
Right.
all of a sudden you really are crafting minds. You really are crafting minds that are going to start questioning things like the Holocaust.
Right.
This is one of the things you see in Gen Z, and I don't think it's arbitrary. Like, I think it's scary, but I don't think it's arbitrary or necessarily, if we look at all the factors in play, surprising that a lot of young people, 25 and younger, maybe 30 and younger, are a lot more suspicious of the Holocaust right now than, say, my generation would ever conceive of being. And I think that's wrong. Nevertheless, when I frame it over against their epistemic environment, the context in which they've been formed, it's not shocking that these questions are coming up like this. And I think that it's not just a judgment on, oh, look, the scary neo-fascists that are rising, though I have those concerns as well. But it's likewise a judgment on a culture that genuinely is giving a kind of degree of plausibility to that headspace. Through, again, and I don't know what else to call it, but a kind of epistemic abuse at the very basis of human pedagogy.
Yeah, when we had, was it the convivium? When was the last time I was there at the Davenant House? Was it for the was for the convivium, right? Yes.
I think so. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and we did a panel on this.
Yep. Yep.
The language that I've been using is this language of like gangland. So to what you're saying is we have these structures of authority, and these structures of authority are largely being undermined, or the force of their authority is diminishing because of the lack of respect for that authority in some way. But they're nevertheless, because of natural law and hierarchies and all the things, there nevertheless just is authority. And so who are we aligning ourselves with as an authority on the things that we should think? And the answer to that is, well, there is a great big menu of personas and personalities from which I can choose to submit myself to that authority. And the disenfranchised Gen Zers are kind of looking at the boomerish stuff going, that's kind of corny and that's kind of gay and I don't like that anymore. And you don't really convince me. But this guy over here, he sounds like he really knows what's going on. And that reminds me of how gangs really survive. They subsist on disenfranchised youth that are looking for some kind of community, that desire some sort of authority. And gangs know this, so what they do is they introduce them to the life of the gang. They give them a language, they give them a name, and then they begin to reward them or hold out potential rewards if the prospective gang member does certain behaviors or carries himself in a way that is, worthy of being associated with the gang. And so now the young person begins to adopt the language and manifest the attributes of the name given and perform actions to receive the praise and the reward of these authorities. And then once that happens, they have them. Now they're in. And now if you say anything about the authority of the gang, that's a very assault on your person. And I see, and I know that all analogies break down somewhere, but I've seen this. One of the reasons I got off of Twitter or X is because I felt some sort of responsibility to say something about things all the time. And I just
Right.
don't have that capacity. But
Right.
you watch people get sucked up into these little pockets. And this is across the board. I'm not singling out any
No,
particular
there's
political.
humans.
This is just human beings.
Yeah.
And before you know it, and to tie my last comment and this comment together, before you know it, all the bits floating around in the brain are then given a logos. They're given a unifying principle that comes from the authority. And they're open to that because they're not open toward accepting previous generations' understanding of the world.
Yep.
And maybe this is just what it's like to get old, Joe. I mean, maybe you and I are just
Well,
trying to
you wonder if we're also in an era where we're highly susceptible to some form of cult.
right.
Uh, the longing for authority, like instead of just admitting, in some sense, the actual confusingness of things, and grieving that, because that is to be grieved. We long for a greater degree of certainty and stability than perhaps we have, and that's good and that's natural and that need not be shamed. Oh,
Yep.
people who are addicted to certainty. Well, we want certainty
Right.
because we're humans, and that's a good thing to want in some way. Um, Nevertheless, what's not good is to pretend that you have it when you don't, or pretend that you've arrived when you haven't. And I think one of the things we're talking about is, in one sense, what a lot of these kinds of movements, a lot of these, what we're seeing, again, as we talk about the students we teach all the time, is perhaps, and as we exegete our own hearts, is as one person put it, you and I, a mutual friend of you and I, that uh, cult is the claim of arrival without pilgrimage. And what a lot of what is being offered on the ground right now is a kind of arrival without pilgrimage. Because as you put it, the answers are already prefabricated. You already know, sorry, there's a bee near me. You already know what you're supposed to say before you know why you're supposed to say it. And you see this. I mean, you really do see, and again, a lot of it is driven by dynamics and stumbling blocks that you have pointed out, which is like, um, certain topics become taboo. We're not able to look at certain facts, and you get superficially, there becomes this impression, oh, nobody's out there dealing with that, but the cool kids over here who are courageous are able to, quote, quote, deal with that,
Right.
that sort of thing. But it can be incredibly driven by the gut. And when put in contact with really good and mature interlocutors, yeah, I don't think it's that simple. But I'll throw it back to
Yeah.
you.
No, and I think this is a golden opportunity
Mm.
for true sages to really enter the discussion and with a calm, settled soul that isn't triggered by the edgy questions of the young people, uh, and listen to what they're actually asking and getting at, and then offering to walk alongside them during this pilgrimage, to actually introduce them to the fact that they are on the way to something,
Right.
right? And that the internal self has its own teleology. We are forming the final cause of ourselves internally, right? We have to recognize that the ideas that are being played around with, and listen, I am not the kind of guy that thinks that we need to quote unquote protect our kids. Now, of course, I want to protect our kids. Hopefully, you know what I mean by that. Hopefully, the listeners understand. I don't shelter children from scary ideas. However, if we are not properly understanding where all of the ideas fit in relationship to one another, and then working out what is good and true and beautiful as we consider these things in a way that recognizes God, then we are forming in ourselves the thing that we will eventually become.
Yeah.
And
So
that I think is, last thing I'll say, that I
you,
think is, it then it becomes less about how how edgy I am or whatever, because it's like you can edge yourself into a habit of life that is very, very, very bad for your soul.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, yeah,
No, I think that's exactly right. Um, and you can protect yourself from everyone else's edges in such a way that's very bad for their soul. And
mm,
here's why I'm saying that. What I think our generation has to develop is an ability to see the kinds of things we've been talking about without freaking out. You know, when you
right,
see the kid who's like I'm not sure the Holocaust ever happened because I was watching these YouTube videos. You don't immediately, that kid is not going to respond to the word racist anymore
right,
because all his YouTube videos have told him anybody who calls you that is a Marxist and blah 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 blah. And so there's a whole generation of young men, especially, and young women, really, um, who are being built to be immune, in a sense, to a lot of the moral things that you would do to kind of prevent people from going a certain direction.
right,
And what that means is you actually do have to kind of understand why are people thinking these thoughts, and enter into a headspace often, especially with young people. Like, it's different when we're talking about people our age who are grooming young people in these ideas. There's a different engagement to be had there that's a little more, maybe has a little more fists involved, right?
right.
Um, but especially with the young and that you're teaching, I think it's very important to really understand actually just humans. And what I mean by that is understand how humans begin to make judgments about what's true and false. The way you began to make judgments about that and how you formed that and the way they're forming that are not totally different. What's different, the mechanisms are not totally different. What's different is the environment, and it's shocking how different that environment might be. And understanding that and having some sense of how to minister to that is, I think, really important for Gen X and millennials kind of looking at those coming next, uh,
Yeah.
to kind of help shape things in as much as there's the possibility to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's key, what you just said, as far as there's the possibility to do that, right? And I really do think that it's time for true sages to surface and to um, start to be intentional about um, real discipleship with people in their communities
Hmm.
and really returning back to books, like reading books. I was telling my sister the other day, because I was having a conversation with one of my teachers, and I feel like reading books is like a spiritual battle at this point.
Hmm.
There's real spiritual warfare happening when it comes to carving out time to read. And I started to read Cicero on the Good Life over the weekend. I think I was telling you this the other night when we were talking. And I say this to people that are maybe the millennials, the older millennials that have children. Maybe they're teachers, maybe they're pastors, maybe they're just dudes in their church and they have younger people around. Start to read good books with them. I'm not saying that if we all read books, we're all going to be sages, but I am saying that no point in human history, no enlightenment has ever come to the human soul without books, except for direct divine revelation from God, right? Without stories or narrative, and maybe not books, but traditions, oral traditions, conversations,
Words.
words.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a good time. It seems like a good time. I mean, if the thesis holds up, and maybe it doesn't, that we are in a dark age, then the only way out is to go back and then find the light and carry
Yeah.
the torch,
And what we
right?
tend to do is read, like Presbyterians always read a book or whatever, but it's not necessarily a good book. This
Right.
is really crucial. And so last thing I'll say, I think it's interesting to just a lot of comments you've made. Some people have made the distinction between we're in a third age of literacy, where there's the distinction between the unreading illiterate and the reading literate. And now you have a distinction between the reading literate and the unreading alliterate, not illiterate. It's like people who have the ability to read but don't read.
Yes.
Historically, that would have been very odd. And if you have the ability to read, the failure to exercise, in some sense, that ability, generally speaking, is impoverishing. Like, you do need, like, at least to some extent, there's an enriching quality to getting a good book and working through it with folks.
Yeah, because I mean, really, on the history, we have our own unique struggles in the modern age with everything that we've been talking about. But nothing new is under the sun, really. I mean, all is vanity and a chasing after the wind. So, finding yourself, I hate to use the language of identity, but allowing your mind to be formed through deliberate consumption of ancient wisdom, say that, is exactly. If you don't do that, there is some what did you say? Yeah, impoverishment
Yeah.
on some level. And so
we're very educated on this podcast.
Yes. And I'm certainly not prescribing anything like this will work, but it doesn't hurt and it might just help a little. So,
that's right, brother.
Yeah. All right. Is that it? Last word,
brother? No, go ahead. Take us out.
All right. All right. Well, everyone, you can always find these episodes posted on the Davenant Institute YouTube channel. Find them wherever podcasts are found. Hopefully, Joe and I will be back in a more regular routine, regular-ish. Life is
that's
still
right. Ish is what we can hope for.
We don't make any promises. But yeah, Joe, I love you, brother.
I love you too, man.
We'll see you guys next time.
See you later.